welcome to our session on feminism and sexology. Let me introduce our first speakers, Andrea Romano, who you probably already know. Thank you again for your efforts, Andrea. Andrea is studying the history of psychology and psychotherapy in an Italian context. And Massimiliano Pompa, who is a PhD student at the Sapienza University.
Yes.
Yes. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Okay. So, Emilio Servadio was born in 1904 in Sestri Ponente, a suburban area of Genoa. His parents were both from a Jewish background. In 1970, he spent a year in Florence with Ons and his maternal grandmother, and there he took lessons from a Hebrew teacher, David Prato, who became later senior rabbi in Rome in 1945. Back in Genoa, during his teenage years, he was attracted by readings such as Les Grands Initiés, Esquisses de l'Histoire Secrète de Religion, from my French, by Edouard Juret, and in studying texts that dealt with animal magnetism, suggestion, hypnosis, as well as texts that were related to the occult and mysterious. From the early 20s, he began, out of curiosity, to gain experience as a hypnotist, learning as a self-taught the various techniques through books. He also studied by observing the theatrical performances of a famous Tuscan hypnotist, who was called Cesare Gabrielli, who inspired Thomas Mann in writing the novella Mario and the Magician, published in 1930. At the same time, he began attending the Society of Scientific Readings and Conversations, a cultural gathering where lectures were organized and attended by Genoa's leading intellectuals, including the poet Eugenio Montale, who would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1975. In 1926, he graduated in law with a thesis on hypnosis in forensic medicine, devoting particular attention to the relationship between the hypnotist and the hypnotized person, often characterized by a neurotic charge. Okay. In 1928, Servadio was called in Rome to collaborate at the Institute of the Italian Encyclopedia Treccani to write articles on psychology, psychoanalysis, and the paranormal. There he started working with psychoanalyst Edoardo Weiss, who moved to Rome from Trieste, and together with Servadio they edited the psychoanalysis entry in the encyclopedia. In those years, Servadio began a 5 times a week analysis with him, after he had communicated to Weiss his desire to become a psychoanalyst. And in 1932, he started to work as a psychoanalyst. Mm-hmm. Now, Servadio's role in the history of Italian psychoanalysis is well known. He was the founder of the Italian Society of Psychoanalysis. But in this speech, we want to highlight the evolution of his conception of sexuality. And as we will see, he will be influenced firstly by psychoanalysis and later by an eclecticism that he developed after several life experiences and after becoming interested in esotericism. In fact, as early as 1929, he published his first magic esoteric writing, signing himself with the pseudonym S. Between 1935 and 1936, he was responsible for editing the psychological part of the entry Sexology in the Italian Encyclopedia Treccani. Servadio recounted that those sexual topics were then treated with the greatest warning in that editorial office. In fact, they were under the inspection of Pietro Tacchi Venturi, who was a Jesuit, who acted behind the scenes of the encyclopedia and played a leading role in state-church relations during the fascist regime. Since the Lateran Treaty in 1929. It's interesting to underline that editors who had to work on entries concerning sexuality used to referring back to the Sexology entry in order to avoid the scrutiny of Tacchi Venturi. So Servadio had to face Giovanni Gentile, the scientific director at the time of the Treccani Encyclopedia, and one of the major protagonists of Italian culture, to be able to work more calmly and to bypass censorship after obtaining his consent about the Sexology entry. Okay. In this first contribution, Servadio's conception of sexuality appears to be entirely based on psychoanalytic theory, This led him to write Freud's name together with those of pioneers in the field such as Krafft-Ebing, Moll, Hirschfeld, Mantegazza, Ellis, Marañón, and many others. Then a significant part of the entry is dedicated to infantile sexuality, with extensive explanation of the Freudian view of the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital phases. Aspects related to sexual psychopathology are divided into three categories: infant manifestations, neurosis, and perversions. This view is also based on the Freudian idea that the etiology of sexual psychopathology can be traced back to a fixation or regression to a particular period of childhood life. Included in the psychopathological categorization, we can also find homosexuality, which was considered an, I quote, object-related perversion, such as fetish, zoophilia, and necrophilia. Servadio defined homosexuality as a perversion after Marañón studies. And according to him, every human being is marked by a variable proportion of original bisexuality, and then subsequent sexual orientation is determined by variable constitutive factors of, and external acquisitions and influences. And the homosexual was defined from a biological point of view as an inverted. On the psychological level, through the psychoanalytic explanation, male homosexuality would have been determined in Servadio's description by, I quote, infantile fixation and identification to a more or less virile maternal image, exclusivist over-evaluation of the male genital, more or less pronounced survival of the eroticism of the pregenital stages, and early submission to the father. On the other hand, female homosexuality was divided into two groups: active and passive. On the active side, the homosexual condition was explained through the unsuccessful renunciation of phallus possession and identification with the father. On the passive side, the explanation was an excessive repression of early heterosexual transports and fear of male aggression. As we can see, Servadio's conception of sexuality was rigidly based on Freudian theory. Anyway, it is interesting to note how it will constantly change through time by the acquisition of new cultural perspectives during his life. He will bring into dialogue with psychoanalysis three areas: Eastern culture, parapsychology, and esotericism. Servadio was exceptionally sensitive to a certain type of subject related to the occult, and in 1937 he was among the founders of the Italian Society of Metapsychics. In this field, Servadio studied extrasensory perceptions, telepathy, and psychokinetic phenomena. His inclination toward this research interest delineated a personality that was not content to rely on academic studies, as he claimed, but sought to build an understanding of phenomena that went beyond the boundaries of traditional science. But the price he had to pay for this curiosity about the paranormal and the occult was the numerous criticisms that he received from his fellow psychoanalysts. In 1938, he was forced to leave Italy because of the racial laws enacted by the fascist regime, and encouraged by Ernest Jones to do pioneering work in a country where there were no psychoanalysts, Servadio decided to travel to India, fascinated by Eastern culture and art. For 8 years, he had the opportunity to merge his psychoanalytic vision with the spiritual aspects of Indian society, particularly yoga and tantrism. He was one of the first to integrate psychoanalysis and meditative practices characteristic of the Eastern cultures. Servadio returned to Italy in January 1946, after the war, and continued his intellectual activity by spreading the assumptions of Eastern thought. In 1954, he participated in the startup of the International Journal of Sexology, publishing articles in it from the very first issue. In addition, his interest in parapsychological phenomena led him on an ethnographic expedition in 1957 with the anthropologist Ernesto De Martino to study the magical practices of healers in the popular culture of Lucania region in the south of Italy. Servadio first proposed a view of sexuality that broke away from psychoanalytic rigidity and accessed a transdisciplinary key in a journal article published in 1959. There, he criticizes an exclusivist theory of homosexuality, based on readings that do not simultaneously take into consideration the multiple factors arising from culture, nature, and personal history. However, he was still considering the possibility of curing neurosis of a homosexual patient through, I quote, an analytic therapy that can radically heal and transform. Between the 70s and the 60s and the 70s, his sexology conception kept on evolving. This perpetual change led to the revision of the conservative positions of psychoanalysis. This shift to a new conception can be seen through his general view of sexuality and through his new conception of homosexuality. Interestingly, this modification is subsequent to his path of initiation into Freemasonry, beginning in 1964. Servadio himself sees the path of initiation as an opportunity for redemption and regeneration using symbolic processes. Symbolism is the vocabulary through which all affective life is expressed, an involuntary and automatic mode of expression of the primitive and the neurotic, the child, the dreamer, and the lover. Esotericism differs from the modern scientific model. It proceeds by symbols and allusions. The Greek etymology of the word means "I let in." This passage implies a revelation that determines the process of initiation corresponding to an awakening, a kind of second birth. And this can take place through different disciplines that can contradict and mutually confirm each other at the same time, such as Kabbalah, magic, yoga, Freemasonry, Hermeticism, and alchemy. Sexuality in the various esoteric disciplines assumes a sacred and magical value, represented through particular symbols that summarize the connection of individuals with universal life energy and the divine. In esotericism, sexuality can be seen as a path to spiritual enlightenment and inner transformation. Some esoteric traditions teach that the sexual act can be a mystical experience and a means of attaining higher states of consciousness. Through sexual union, male and female energies unite, creating a harmonious balance and allowing the manifestation of higher spiritual potentials. The union of the masculine and the feminine, whose symbols are the sun and the moon, respectively, represents the highest human expression from the esoteric point of view. We have a concrete example of this esoteric conception of sexuality, and precisely during the 70s in Italy, the esotericist Francesco Siniscalchi established contact with the young writer Mario Meli, which you can see, who was interested in alchemy and esotericism. The reason for this intellectual bond, however, was based on the belief that Mieli, a homosexual rights activist, perfectly embodied the co-presence of the feminine and the masculine. Servadio himself, who knew Siniscalchi, indicates how one of the few Western parallels to the Tantric teachings is found in alchemical Hermeticism, in which the aspirant must perform a series of primarily inner operations aimed at the creation of the androgyne, or rebis, in which the male and female principles are finally merged. In the path of initiation, corporeality is radiated by the ego, which leads to a reversal in which the vulgar body has been succeeded by the magical body. That is, in alchemical terms, lead has been transmuted into gold, and the dead stone has become the philosopher's stone. In sexual union, the tendency toward fusion will indicate an overcoming of duality and the tendency toward a final unity experienced to its extreme limits. In other words, sexual union is compared by Servadio to I quote, a mystical union understood as a dissolution and immersion of the soul in divinity, in which the distinction between male and female no longer makes sense. We have the divided and the undivided, the individual and the universal. And this dynamic is universal and ties Western and Eastern cultures. Servadio links this conception to the psychoanalytic reading proposed by Ferenczi, in which, in the supreme moment of sexual intercourse, all dualities will be lost, and one partner will tend to lose himself in the other, as in a phylogenetic experience of a return to the sea. This view is integrated with that of the Eastern culture of the metaphysical doctrine of Tantrism, whereby sexuality is the derivation of what happens at the cosmic level, and the existing world is a continuous birthing whereby from the organ of the feminine the universe emerges. I quote Servadio, "The act of love is also a reflection of the cosmic act. The more it tends toward fullness, the closer it comes to the primordial divine act. And every practitioner must identify with the female deity, Shakti, who potentially resides within him, and in the course of the sexual act, he must not cease for a moment from focusing on the symbolic and the cosmic relationship between Shiva and his female counterpart." So, this much more open view has also a significant influence in his conception of homosexuality. In the volume Sex and Psyche, published in 1979, Servadio argues that homosexuality becomes a simple personality trait, and it is meaningless, from his point of view, to raise the question of whether or not it is a disease. Finally, dealing with both male and female homosexuality, he criticizes psychoanalysis, who do not examine cross-cultural variables, by recognizing anti-homosexuality attitude as the real etiological factor in the psychopathological categorization. It should be noted that as early as 1973, the diagnosis of homosexuality had been eliminated from the DSM, with the preservation of the ego-dystonic classification deleted only in 1987. Therefore, it would be naive to consider the broadening of his cultural horizon as the only element that had an impact in the evolution of Servadio's thinking in the field of sexology. It is certain that he had studied the research of Kinsey and Master Johnson, for example, just as he was familiar with the evolutions of the DSM. But it's also possible to argue that he maintained his own autonomy in the reading of the phenomenal field of sexuality. He also doubted the generalized psychoanalytic reductionism on the theme, somehow always related to a certain relational pattern with the mother. He stated that Eros has a universal character, so why do we necessarily want to limit it to a male-female relationship at the adult level? There are endless possibilities for expansion and diversification in the management of sexuality. In conclusion, it is clear how the conception of sexuality in Servadio's writings has been changing over the years. While it was initially based on psychoanalytic assumption and closer to a medical model, it later incorporates a cultural anthropological view. It cannot be argued that the evolution of his thought has shifted from a conservative pole to a progressive one. Servadio used to differentiate two different kinds of sexual freedoms. On the one hand, the conquest achieved with the 68 movements, and this was regarded as free access to any form of sexual expression of sexuality on the expressive and the commercial level. But on the other hand, he positioned what he calls the true sexual freedom, and this was consisting of the transmutation of sexual energy to achieve a higher freedom that refers to the ultimate goal of sexuality in esotericism, that is to put the human in contact with the divine. Servadio specifies how this aspect should not be confused as a return to reactionary positions. However, at the same time, he criticizes a famous Italian novel called Pigs with Wings, Porci con le ali, which generated enormous stir in Italy in the 70s. Servadio criticized the novel not so much because of the themes it contained, such as rejection of the family and promiscuity, but because of the vulgar portrayal attributed to the protagonist, who represented the teen generation of the 70s and depicted sexuality as something of low value. So it is possible to say that esotericism had a strong influence in his conception of sexuality to the point of considering it sacred. Only 5 years before his death, Servadio had an interview, and he answered the question of whether he considers himself a conservative or a progressive, and he stated, you can read it, both, because certain fundamentals are what they are. I am conservative in the sense that certain universal principles are what they cannot change. I am progressive in the sense that I am not at all insensitive to certain changes, for example, to the social and sociocultural setup. For example, it makes an impression on me that there are many topless women on beaches. Why not? 50 years ago, it would have made on me a certain impression on me, but this is a sign of the times. And that's it. Thank you.
for this very interesting and very informative paper. Actually, I have a question. So, do we know anything about the institutionalized background of Servadio in esotericism? Did he belong to any known esoteric circles, like lodges, or anything else?
Yeah, sure. We know well. Actually, Servadio wrote he was into the different lodges. One of the famous, the most famous is the P2, that in Italy it was a really controversial lodge because there was a great scandal about this lodge, really big scandal in Italy.
What kind of scandals are you asking?
Yeah, it's a really big topic. They
Yes,
were trying to subvert the political system. But he also ran away from this lodge at some point. But he also, the most interesting thing I think about it, he was into a lodge that was called Hermes, with Francesco Siniscalchi, the esotericist that took contact with Mario Mieli, as Massimiliano read before. There was a lodge where they were studying Hermeticism, symbology, and something interesting also, not related to institutional issues or lodges, is that he was also meeting with some intellectuals, such as, for example, Fellini, the movie director, and Rota, the artist that was editing the music for Fellini's movies. And they were talking about esotericism, symbology, and even sexuality. So these were the most important groups that he was joined. And from the institutional side, he was a member of the Italian Parapsychology Society,
Yes.
for example.
Yeah.
He was one of the founders.
Yes. Excellent, thank you. Very interesting. Any questions, comments, Kim?
Well, I'd like to just follow that up and ask what is his official institutionalization? So does he have a role at a university as well, or really he's independent?
He was one of the founders of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society. I think this is the most important institution that he was a member.
But he's not in a hospital or a...
No. He was graduated in law, so he wasn't a physician or no. He was graduated in law, so he couldn't work into an hospital. But that's why, for example, in the abstract, we wrote about the integration of medicalization and demedicalization of the sexology conception, because he was really free to integrate different perspectives into his sexological thought. Yeah.
Further questions? Yeah, from myself.
I was curious to hear if you came across the work of Emilio Servadio. It sounds like...
Tommaso, I cannot hear you well.
You hear me?
Yeah, now yes.
It's for Andrea, request. Did you come across the work of Emilio Servadio, particularly the metaphysics of sex, which seems like really akin to his ideas? And one thing I was wondering, I'm not sure I grasped the practical part, like what kind of experience he had about what he was talking about, because someone like him was with many of them lost and that kind of sexual skills.
Well, of course, he was really young when he met Evola, so he was not really aware. But no, I'm joking. Yeah, he met Evola. He was super young, and he was also collaborating in the beginning for the group of Ur. But he never took part to any kind of activities, sexual activities. He was only cooperating for writing some esoterical articles.
And do you know his pseudonym for the US?
S. E.S.
Emilio Servadio.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Any further questions, comments? Then thank you again
Thank you.
for this great